What's good, y'all? It's your boy Jay back at it again, and today we got Life Aboard a Slave Ship was Pure Horror by Flashback History. Follow me on both Jays here and Jays there. Without further ado, let's get around to it.
It's 1525. We're on the coast of Sao Tome in West Africa.
Yeah, that slavery stuff was awful. And it started with the Portuguese, actually. It was definitely the Portuguese first. Then it was picked up by the English, the Spanish, and then the French, as they needed cheap labor to settle the New World. And since poor white Europeans weren't willing to do that, they had to get slaves.
As a Portuguese ship is setting sail, the ship's destination is New Spain, the newly established Spanish territory in the Americas. There's nothing particularly unusual about this voyage. It's the 16th century, and maritime trade is the bedrock of empires. And with new territories and new lands, long ocean-spanning voyages have become pretty commonplace. But this ship is different. Down in the bowels lies a different kind of cargo. Rather than spices, gold, or textiles, this ship carries people. It will take months for the ship to sight land in the Americas, and over that time, many of those people will have lost their lives, passing away in misery in the dark, squalid conditions below decks.
Shit was terrible, bro. Weren't they like chained up to where they couldn't even move or do anything? Like that shit's or I don't understand how you as a human could do this to another human. Like I dead ass, like that shit just doesn't compute in my brain. How you as a person could just watch another person you know has done almost nothing wrong, and you just stand there watch them suffer and squeal like, hey, nah, bitch.
Tragic, anonymous victims will become the first lives claimed by the Middle Passage, the route by which enslaved people are transported from the coast of Africa to the colonies and plantations of the New World. They may be the first to make this grim voyage, but they will not be the last. Over the next 400 years, millions more will die on this crossing. Right into the mid-19th century and even beyond, human beings,
slavery still exists, my nigga. That's fuck,
will fall victim to this trade. They'll have their dignity stripped from them, and they'll be loaded into boats, becoming part of one of the most shameful chapters in human history. The Atlantic slave trade is a sprawling and deeply upsetting topic, but for this video, we're focusing on the boats themselves.
Hey, but it's so simple. We gotta talk about that shit. Like, we can't just, like, shit like that, you can't just, like, let it be like, oh, it happened. No. We gotta talk about that shit. Let them know, like, how evil, like, look at this. Look at how many bodies are here. No clothes, no real food, no water. Look at how they're packed like sardines. Look at this shit. No personal space whatsoever. Terrible, money.
The grim mechanism that kept these murderous trade routes moving. As always, on these darker topics, some of the details have been censored to comply with YouTube's policies, but a fully uncensored, ad-free version is available on our Patreon.
Tight.
I lost a lot of weight recently, and none of my clothes fit.
Like, this may be a more chill reaction, cause like I don't know if I want to be telling jokes on slavery. Like, I don't know, bro, because this is already like a serious, like, I already know the style of this video gonna be mad serious, and that's not even me trying to be mean or being like, no, he needs to tell jokes. No, I'm saying that because, like, I'm not about to be cracking jokes and this nigga talking about the horrors of slavery. Like, nah, man, we just gonna keep this more informational.
The practice of slavery, that is, the practice of one human being owned by another human, is older than civilization itself. But the development of the Atlantic slave trade from
but the Atlantic slave trade was different from what I know, because it was the first time slavery, or it was if it wasn't the first time, it was the main time that slavery became a race thing rather than just a class thing. Because yeah, people in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, they had slaves, but I'm 95% sure that they were not treating the slaves as barbarically and as cruelly as Europeans were treating the slave ships from West and South Africa.
16th century onwards brought the whole thing to a new and horrifying level. It became an industrialized practice, as human beings were systematically captured, brutalized, and sold into slavery across continents. They sailed on ships bearing many different flags, such as Portugal, Britain and Spain, as well as France, the Netherlands, the United States and Denmark, amongst others. It's believed that between 12 and 15 million people were forcibly captured in Africa and then transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. To put that into perspective, the population of modern Portugal is only around 10.7 million.
So
most of these people,
Portugal's entire population, and then half of that already population just being shipped all over the place,
were transferred via the Middle Passage. In other words, they sailed west from Africa directly across the Atlantic to South America, the Caribbean, or north to the North American colonies. This might take a month, or it could take 6 months if the weather was bad, and every inch of the way, enslaved peoples would be subject to the most horrendous conditions and abject misery. It was essentially an extended act of violence designed to break the spirit of its victims and eliminate any chance of escape. And this violence began from the very moment the victims were captured. Abu Bakr al-Sadiq was born to an affluent family in what is now Mali in 1794. Like most young people, Abu had dreams and hopes of his own, and when he heard about the gold mines in Buona, today's Ivory Coast, he knew what he had to do. But when conflict between two sultanates tore the region apart, Abu found himself captured. He was sold into transatlantic slavery.
Yeah. African warlords and leaders would often sell slaves, like their own people, into slavery in exchange for goods, resources, weapons like guns, etc. They would often trade slaves in favor of things like that. But the problem with that is you're decreasing your population, you're trading with the Europeans, and they're getting more bang from their buck because they're using slaves to settle massive amounts of territory that has more resources, while these African warlords were still just fighting amongst each other, and they didn't really technologically advance. So when Europeans came down in the late 19th century, aka the 1800s, niggas just got horrifically just got done.
And forced to undergo conversion from his Muslim faith to Christianity. Abu's story is a familiar one. Hundreds of thousands of people were captured in warfare as victorious armies profited from the defeat of weaker opponents. But there was a problem. There simply weren't enough wars to keep up with demand. To fill the gap, private raiding parties emerged. These were bands of pirates and profiteers who rounded up human commodities ready to be sent to the colonies of the New World. In doing so, they provided the economic foundation for globe-spanning European empires. This was how a young man named Oluda Aquilano found himself sold into slavery. Oluda was born in 1745 in an Igbo village named Asaka in what is now Nigeria. His early years were spent in relative normality. He had a happy childhood, his parents would go out and tend to their work, and he and his sister would stay at home and watch the house until they returned. In his own words, "I still look back with pleasure on the first scenes of my life, though that pleasure has been for the most part mingled with sorrow." Because one day, this early life changed. He and his sister were at home as usual when two men and a woman Oloda didn't recognize came into the yard. Oloda and his sister were bound, gagged, and then carried off into the woods. There they were separated and taken away to the slave markets to be sold. This separation was at the heart of the slave trade.
They wanted to separate families, because if you're separated from your family, you have less to fight for. So you're gonna be, you know how a man's gonna fight harder when his family's in danger. You separate him from his family, he has less to fight for, he's weaker, less chance of resistance.
Snatched unexpectedly and then separated from their friends and family. They'd be taken far away, to places they'd never seen before, and sold from person to person until there was no hope of ever returning home. Disoriented, frightened, and hopelessly alone, enslaved people would become trapped in a system from which there was no escape. Oluda would have been chained and shackled. A taming stick would have been placed around his neck, connecting him to another.
They train these regular, actual human beings like dogs and like look at this shit, nigga. Actually, this might be the thumbnail. Hold on, that might be the thumbnail.
The captive. Then he and his fellow victims were marched in long lines known as coffles, from which there was no escape. As kidnapping victims were marched to the slave markets on the coast, they would have had a glimpse of what awaited them if they tried to escape. By the roadside, bodies decomposed into skeletal remains, the remnants of those who had tried to make a run for it. If this deterrent wasn't enough, raiding parties often resorted to violence. Otobad Cogueno was just a boy when he was captured while playing in a field with his friends. Originally from modern-day Ghana, Otoba was taken far away from his home to the coast to be sold. Otoba would later say, "Some of us attempted to run away, but pistols and cutlasses were soon introduced. If we offered to stir, we should all lie dead on the spot." If the victims survived their death march, which not all did, they would then be placed into holding cells known as barracoons. This was basically a prison where there was no privacy, and snarling dogs would keep the terrified victims in line. One by one, these victims would be taken out of the pen and then subjected to an inspection. Inspection was, as you can imagine, both dehumanizing and humiliating. Enslaved people would be stripped naked and have their bodies poked and prodded to assess their general health and musculature. Teeth were considered a major indication of health, so inspectors would examine the inside of victims' mouths, not unlike one might examine a horse. For women and girls, it was even worse. Fertility was a big part of the examination, and inspectors would use the latest pseudoscience of the day to figure out the reproductive potential of enslaved women. This typically involved poking around their breasts, pelvis, and groin areas in a process that would have been both highly invasive and seriously traumatic. As enslaved peoples were likely to be sold multiple times, these inspections would happen again and again throughout the victim's life. So that they could be easily identified, victims were often branded with hot iron, the smell of their searing skin turning the stomachs of their fellow inmates. Such was the symbolic, dehumanizing power of the barracoon that Zora Neale Hurston used it as the title for her book on the life of Oluwalikosala, who was taken from Bante in Benin and sold into slavery in America. Interestingly, the sale of Olula took place around 1860, more than 50 years after the importation of enslaved Africans was banned in the United States. But back to the trade itself. See, the Middle Passage typically involved a complex series of transactions. Captives might be sold several times before they even made their journey across the Atlantic. They might then be sold again and again on the other side. Aluda Equiano, for example, said he changed owners several times in Africa. He was then sold in Barbados and then sold again in the colony of Virginia. But most enslaved people would, sooner or later, find themselves being loaded onto an ocean-crossing ship. And this could happen in one of two ways. One method was the tight pack. This just meant pushing as many...
Like I said, packed like sardines, like... You know that they weren't cleaning these areas properly. So these areas were just getting rife with disease, illnesses, or all that. And they most likely just threw the bodies overboard and kept it pushing. Like, they ain't care. Like, you know, like, this shit was actually terrible.
Many people as possible into the cargo hold, and often this hold would only be 5 feet high, so not high enough for most people to stand comfortably, but at the same time there would be so many people on board that lying down was impossible too. Around the edge of the space there would be a wooden ledge upon which more enslaved people could be packed. The captain of one slave ship noted that the tight pack involved packing people in, quote, like books on a shelf.
Terrible. Actually, these are real human beings. I mean, dead ass, like, actually awful.
The other method was the loose pack. Enslaved people were herded loosely into a cargo hold below the deck, and they probably have just enough room to lie down. This suggests that the loose pack was the better of the two options, and perhaps it was, but there's something we've got to bear in mind here, and that is, of course, sanitation, or, to be more specific, the lack of sanitation. Captives would have to relieve themselves wherever they stood, urinating, defecating.
So gross. Like, imagine all the fecal matter in urine and excrement that would just accumulate in the ship. Imagine the smell. Like, nah.
Vomiting and menstruating onto the ground that they were standing or lying on. With so many people packed into a tiny space, conditions rapidly deteriorated, becoming nothing short of disgusting. Even if a loose pack gave captives some space to lie down, they'd literally be lying in their own filth. All of that sewage and waste led to a foul stench and a heavy, fetid atmosphere. Candles brought down into the cargo holds would gutter and falter as there simply wasn't enough oxygen to burn. It was also said that a slave ship could be smelt before it even entered the harbour, such was the level of filth on board. Needless to say, sickness spread quickly on these ships. Many of the captives would have had infectious diseases. Ailments like smallpox quickly hopped from person to person in the conditions. The British slave ship Hannibal was ravaged by smallpox in 1693 and 1694. Of 700 captives, only 372 made it through the passage alive. 36 crew members also perished. Another British ship, the Luxembourg Galley, suffered a similar fate on the way to Jamaica in 1726. More than 203 enslaved Africans died of the pox. In 1781, Captain Luke Collingwood demonstrated the dehumanizing horror of the slave trade.
This might be the thumbnail too, I ain't gonna lie.
When smallpox ravaged his own ship, the Zong. After losing more than 60 of his captives to the disease, Collingwood decided it would be better to lose them all and just claim his loss on the insurance rather than proceed without profit. He began forming parcels of victims, binding them together and then throwing them overboard.
So fucking awful, bro.
More than 130 victims were chained and thrown into the sea in this manner. Historian Giles Milton describes how the women and children of the first parcel, quote, could be seen flailing in the sea before eventually weakening and drowning. Even in the context of the Atlantic slave trade, this is a particularly disturbing tale because it underlines the fact that these human beings were not treated as people at all, but instead treated like goods on a shipping manifest and figures on an insurance claim. The only upside to this story is that Luke Collingwood himself died only 3 days after landing in Jamaica. In a very small sense, justice was served. But
all trees are on sale right now at Michael's. Bring home holiday joy with up to 70% off trees.
Slow down, honey. Too fast, Trevor, too fast.
I know what I'm doing, Mom.
Ah, a new driver.
Yeah.
Big ass zebra in the back seat. But no, yeah, this shit is terrible. Like the things these people went through, like this is barbaric. Like it's some barbaric, like the fact that you can look at a woman and just be like, you know, I'm gonna throw her overboard with her baby. Time to get like. That's some evil that's some evil shit, bro. I ain't gonna lie. Like you going to hell. Like you going to the deepest, darkest pits.
But pox wasn't the only story that disease brings here either. When food and water was thrown into the hold to keep the captives alive, it quickly became contaminated with the fecal matter and urine that sloshed back and forwards on the floor. As a result,
don't say slosh, but what the nigga said slosh, bro. He said slosh. He said it slosh. Oh my, bro, this the image that shit conjures up. Oh nah. I am thankful for a world of plumbing. I ain't gonna lie, like.
Salt, dysentery was rife. Of course, this made the conditions below decks even worse, as victims couldn't control their own bowel movements. Ship captains did little to prevent dysentery during the voyage itself, but they certainly tried to hide it once they reached the other side. It was difficult to sell a captive suffering from dysentery, so the crews would take a length of rope and then insert it into the victim.
Goody, yay, more violation. Like, bro, this shit. I'm sorry if I'm not talking as much as I do in some of my other reactions, but like, what am I supposed to say, bro? This shit morbid. Like, there is nothing much I can do but to sit and let this man speak about the horrors of slavery while I sit there and say how bad this stuff is. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do right now, but like, there's nothing else. Like, I'm not finna be telling cracking jokes. Nah, this is not the video for that, boy.
Then they plugged the hole with tar. Whoever then proceeded to purchase this poor human wouldn't know they had dysentery until long after the transaction had been completed. Another problem was, this is at sea after all, scurvy. and there was simply no way to keep food fresh and edible. So things like
there's no way to keep food fresh and edible. They ain't have refrigerators or coolers or none of that. And plus, all the food that the slaves would get is going to be contaminated with all types of boo-boo and filth. So you don't win regardless. Like it's terrible either way you look at it.
like fresh fruit and other important nutrients simply weren't available. Anything that could be used to prevent scurvy was then kept for crew, which meant that the enslaved people below deck were abandoned to the disease
no type of vitamin C
and fate. There's a lot of talk about scurvy in maritime history, but little engagement with just what the disease is and how serious it is. Some of the early symptoms include general fatigue and weariness, as well as feelings of depression, joint pain, and loss of appetite. But let's be honest, the helpless victims in the cargo hold would have already been experiencing a lot of this. They probably wouldn't even have noticed until the disease really took hold. And then we see what happens in more...
Yeah, sore gums, your stomach, your feet are itching, your sea legs are no longer... You are irritable. You got rabbly ass, bro. I ain't gonna lie. Nah.
Advanced cases of scurvy, bleeding gums, and wounds that simply won't heal. As you can imagine, in the extremely unsanitary conditions below deck, with chain...
Yeah, it made it worse, because not only are they getting scurvy and having bleeding gums, like the skin is opening, and all the filth and disgust is just been marinating in that vicinity for God knows how long. So, like, once you get sick, it's GG's.
And manacles that rubbed at the skin, creating wounds not to heal. It would be easy to catch a death sentence. Many people perished from completely preventable infections, coughing their last in the septic hell of the cargo hold of a slave ship. It's estimated that between 15 and 16% of all enslaved people transported across the Middle Passage died on the way. This is horrifying enough, but it's even more disturbing when you consider the cramped space. When someone dropped dead, they stayed there until someone came down to fish them out. So dead people remained alongside the living for hours on end, sometimes days, accelerating the spread of disease and exacerbating the psychological horror of those left behind. When they were finally plucked from the hold, corpses were unceremoniously thrown overboard. Marine predators learned to follow the slave ships, knowing that they could find an easy meal from the corpses in the ship's wake. But death wasn't really the aim of the slave traders. They'd of course much preferred to keep their victims alive so that they could be sold.
Yeah, kind of hard to keep people alive when you're packing them like sardines with no real food or water or sanitation. Like, it's very, very, very difficult to do that.
So when victims stopped eating, either due to illness or trauma, they were force-fed. For this, slavers used the speculum oris. This was a pair of calipers that could be inserted painfully into the throat. A screw at the base of the instrument could then be tightened, forcing the mouth open. The throat would be horribly stretched and torn, but at least some sort of sustenance could be poured into the victim, keeping them alive for another few days. While this was supposed to be a medical implement, it was...
Wouldn't it also cause infection because you're tearing like... Nah.
Actually pretty torturous. It's telling that Thomas Clarkson includes it alongside disciplinary equipment in his 1808 book on the African slave trade. The equipment includes the wrist manacles and leg shackles designed to prevent movement, which would chafe at the skin and leave great lesions on the limbs. It also includes thumb screws, devices that would fit over the hand of the victim and be tightened until the bones within were crushed and splintered. This could be used as a method of torture to extract the name of conspirators and collaborators, or simply as a deterrent for potential troublemakers. It's hardly surprising the ship captains used this kind of barbaric equipment. After all, they were engaged in a barbaric trade. But what is surprising is the obsession that some captains had with health and fitness. It was as if they believed that a bit of exercise would counteract all the...
thought a bit of exercise and dancing would counteract all the horrific shit. Nigga, this is like you get hit with a goddamn... It's like you, bro, imagine you get shot 14 times like you 50 Cent and a nigga put a Band-Aid on you. That's what this is. That is deadass what this image right here. Like, this is like, bro, nah, but... You, like, what is the thought process? Like, alright, these slaves, they're in... horrific conditions, right? So if we let them dance, it will offset all of it. Like, no, that's not how that works, buddy.
The dysentery, the smallpox, and the psychological trauma. Groups of captives would be hauled up on deck and forced to dance for an hour or even longer. And rather than an expression of joy and creativity, it was an expression of pure fear. They'd be whipped if they didn't comply. It was also an exercise in humiliation. Crews would jeer at the enslaved people as they danced and jumped, their movements made slow and lumbering by weeks of malnutrition and beatings. Some of the exact details have been left out of this video, but as I said, they are available on Patreon. People aboard slave ships were no longer...
I'm guessing some of the extra details would include assault and RAP. I'm guessing that's what the extra details are.
People. They were products. They were commodities that needed to be transported through the Middle Passage for sale. This barbaric dehumanization robbed enslaved peoples of their dignity, their agency, and even their humanity. But there was still a way that they could fight back against the slave traders. They could hit their enslavers where it hurt them most. Profits. But this, of course, meant making the ultimate sacrifice. As Royal Museum's Greenwich curator Aaron Jaffa tells us, committing suicide could be an act of rebellion. The crews of slave ships were always anxious to prevent enslaved people from killing themselves, because each person who managed to take their own life reduced the voyage's profits. So men and women would refuse to eat. They'd hold food in their mouths, then spit it out at the last moment rather than swallow it. When the crews got wise to this, they'd flog them or force-feed them using the speculum auris that we saw earlier on. Other desperate captives simply threw themselves overboard, but the ship crews always worked hard to counteract this. They installed netting, which would catch the escapees before they hit the water. One man wrote about how the nets stopped him in his tracks, quote, "Could I have got over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side, but I could not." Of course, such was the abject misery aboard slave ships that suicide often wasn't an act of rebellion at all, but merely one of miserable necessity. As Dr. Jaffa tells us, many were unable to cope with the long and traumatic journey.
I can't blame them, bro.
Regularly involved beatings, murder, and...
that's what I said earlier. That's the details he has to leave out. Violence, assault, and that as well, yeah.
Some hoped that death would take them back to Africa. But for those who did choose self-elimination as a final grim act of rebellion, it was better to take as many of their enslavers down with them as they possibly could. Let's not forget, there were plenty of weapons on board these ships, and enslaved Africans could draw upon knives and swords as well as firearms. They just needed to get their hands on them. Then they could take out their fury on their captors, even if the odds were stacked against them. Eric Robert Taylor's book, If We Must Die, gives us a number of accounts from insurrections on board slave ships. In 1750, the King David was sailing from Old Calabar in Biafra to St. Kitts when the ship's captain, named Holland, encountered an unusual man on the slave deck. The man could speak English well and became something of a favourite of the captain. The unnamed man then used his position of trust to learn more about the ship and its crew, and when illness weakened the slave traffickers, he seized his chance. At 5 a.m. on May the 8th, 1750, the enslaved people on board the King David rose up in revolt. Captain Holland was among the first to die, followed by 5 others. The rebels took control of the ship, but they were now sailing into uncertainty. It seems they attempted to land at La Desirade off of Guadalupe, but when the French authorities learned of their arrival, they raised the alarm. For 2 weeks, the rebels evaded capture aboard the King David until a sloop caught up with them. The enslaved people who had survived the insurrection were simply re-enslaved, and the grim cycle continued. This was the tragic, futile outcome of most rebellions. Most, but not all. To make sure this grim cycle didn't continue, captives had to resort to desperate measures, which brings us to the final story in our video. On January 24th, 1773, the New Britannia was sailing down the Gambian River. The region of Senegambia, comprising the modern-day countries of the Gambia and Senegal, was one of the key locations in the West African slave trade. The region was home to a complex mix of different tribes and ethnic groups. Raiding parties would focus on specific groups, take prisoners, and then send them across the Atlantic. The Bijagos seemed like an ideal target for these raiding parties. They were one of the smallest groups in the area and lacked the military strength and strategic alliances of some of their neighbours. But the Bijago had developed something of a reputation. Rather than submit to the whims of their captors, their people would prefer to take their own lives. This final act of self-sacrifice,
they said, y'all gonna have to kill me before I get involved in that type of stuff. I ain't gonna front.
they hoped would not only set themselves free, but would also protect their descendants from future attacks. The strategy did not work. They were still targeted by raiding parties, and so in January of 1773 they decided on a slightly different approach. As they were led in chains to the boats, local children reached out to them. They gave them tools, things like files, which could be used to break their chains. As the ship sailed away downriver, the captives got to work. They freed themselves from their shackles, then they shattered the wooden wall of the prison, and now they had their eyes on the guards. It's likely that they fought for more than an hour, and it was a pretty bitter struggle. While the rebels were armed with tools and knives, the crew were armed with the firearms of the late 18th century. But there were only 13 slave traffickers, and there were 222 captives.
Oh that's I ain't gonna lie, that's mass assault doctrine. I ain't gonna front.
For a while, anyway. It seems the rebels had the upper hand. No one's quite sure how many died in the battle. Witnesses from the riverbank believe that there were many deaths on both sides. But no one from the thick of the fighting lived to tell the tale. After an hour of bloody struggle, the rebels lit the New Britannia's magazine aflame. It didn't burn for long. An almighty explosion ripped across the ship, killing everyone on board. Perhaps the rebels wanted to make a statement with their dramatic and resonant suicide. Or maybe they simply thought that they were doomed either way. Setting fire to the magazine and killing themselves and their captors probably seemed like the best option they had left.
Yeah, I mean, even if they did somehow manage to sell the ship, what's to stop the Europeans from tracking them down and putting them back into slavery?
And with this action, they had broken the cycle. They wouldn't be re-enslaved like their brothers and sisters aboard the King David 2 decades before. They had won their freedom, just in the most tragic of ways.
God damn, that was a morbid video. That might be the most morbid, like, depressing video we've watched on this channel ever. But with that being said, shout out Flashback History, man. But yeah, man, that's the slave trade. But with that being said, it's your boy Jay. Stay healthy, stay wealthy, and stay blessed. And I'm out.